All right, we're going to start the primary source and chronology analysis for the Cold War beginnings essay. And in order to understand where we need to go, we need to know the question that we are addressing. So our objective is which nation state was more responsible for starting the Cold War by writing a chronological historical narrative that utilizes evidence from both primary and secondary sources. And we need to answer the question, who is to blame, the U.S. or the Soviet Union, in heightening and increasing tensions after the Second World War. Okay? And so, because this is a narrative essay, what we want to be able to do is to put events in sequence. Okay? So, more or less logically, from one event to the next to the next, sometimes chronologically, sometimes by theme. Okay? But what's written here, if you open up the document, is a series of either events or various time periods. Okay? And in doing so, there are documents that are associated on the left-hand side. So you can go ahead and take a look at each event and also the documents that are linked for each one. Okay? But what we want to do is to take a look at, in the end, who is more to blame, the United States or the Cold War, or the Soviet Union in starting the Cold War. Okay? And so as I go through this lecture, what you want to be able to do is to, for each one, okay, go ahead and as you listen to each particular time period, go ahead and make a decision. Okay? Is the United States or the Soviet Union more at fault? Okay? And what you want to be able to do is, if you believe so, just go ahead and click on the link and just go ahead and click on the box there in order to check which one you think is more to blame. So for this portion, just simply listen or review the transcript, and it'll give you an idea of the sequence of events as we've gone through it in class. All right, so let's go ahead and begin. Okay. So before the war, there was mutual suspicion on both sides and major distrust. Okay. So on one hand, you have, say, for example, the Soviet Union, which from the start aimed to try to, as you see in Stalin's speech, to be able to eliminate capitalism both at home in the Soviet Union and Russia. And we see this historically with the persecution of groups like the kulaks, the seizure of lands, the sending of people to the gulags, right, the prison camps and the work camps, and so forth, by this authoritarian regime. Not only to eliminate classes that they think were oppressive, but then also groups that might have resisted as well. So in the Soviet Union, they have actively aimed to eliminate communism, not just simply at home, but also maybe even abroad as well. So there's that threat that the United States might feel. All the while, the United States has always been very suspicious of the Soviet Union. And not only that, but communism as a whole. This political cartoon shows that there were a lot of anti-communist rhetoric surrounding the United States since the beginning of the Soviet Union. And going all the way back to, say, for example, the occupation of parts of the Soviet Union during the Russian Civil War right after the Second World War ends. And not only that, but a number of what are called Red Scares, where in the United States there were persecution of socialists and communists who they believed was going to overthrow the American government at some point. And that's sort of the political cartoon that you see here, that the communists were going to try to take over. And so the United States had this sense of distrust toward anyone, even Americans who were even supporting the communists at any point. So there's, before the war, mutual distrust on both sides. But like we saw, because of the Second World War, because Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, Japan attacked the United States, all three powers, Britain, the US, and Russia, came together to defeat Nazi Germany. And they tried their best, right? These propaganda posters here from the United States and here from Russia attempted to show that we are allies, we've got the same cause, and they worked together in the end to achieve victory. But what happens after the war? And from the American point of view, there's this sense that the Soviet Union, we kind of revert back to the threat of not just the Soviet Union, but Russia in the 19th century, that Russia was this great threat that might, in the end, overwhelm Europe. And this looked more likely to happen as the enormously powerful Red Army is occupying parts of Germany, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Bulgaria, Romania, and so forth, and maybe setting their sights on Western Europe, that the rest of Germany, Italy, France, where there are a lot of communists actually who see communism as a real possibility, will end up trying to seize power. So there's this fear that the Soviet Union is going to roll throughout the rest of Europe as well. Okay? And much of this is going to be illustrated in George Kennan's long telegram as he advises Truman on what to do with the threat of the Soviet Union. Okay? And we see this if you read Kennan's telegram, one of our key documents, document number 11, that he believes that the Soviet Union is a threat. At the exact same time, the Soviet Union has gone through a series of invasions, 3 or 4 from Western Europe in the previous 150 years, and that this possible threat may happen again. And so, from the Soviet point of view, what they see from the United States is the possibility that they might invade with a Western alliance. And so, this is illustrated in Nikolai Novikov's telegram back to Stalin after the Second World War. And so, the key diplomats are sort of warning their leaders that all those pre-war feelings of one another, it may actually result in an invasion or a threat in what they believe is their way of life. And so all of this gets complicated as Western and Eastern Europe are divided up into these occupation zones, and these occupation zones become spheres of influence for both sides. And this is even more complicated by the fact that these occupation zones result in Berlin, which is in the Soviet zone right here, being divided up into various occupation zones within the Soviet sphere as well. And so this is going to lead to major complications in the next few decades. But the first major test in terms of whether or not the United States and the Soviet Union are going to act happens to be in Greece. Now, Greece was formerly occupied by Nazi Germany, and throughout the Second World War, Greek rebels, both communist rebels and anti-communist, pro-monarchist, pro-democracy rebels, all fought against the Soviet Union. Britain, particularly, was interested in Southern Europe, sent a small contingent to try to not only fight against Germany, but then also to try to formulate a Greek government after the war. Now, after Britain leaves, because it has a multitude of problems once the Second World War ends, the United States has a decision because you have a communist Greeks and also anti-communist Greeks who are now fighting against one another because the coalition, the government that they tried to form, ended up failing. And so many of the communists end up in the countryside, and they're fighting against an anti-communist government in Greece. And so what that results in is our first sort of communist, anti-communist civil war. What should the United States do about this? And so the United States, fearing that there would be Soviet intervention, even though there really wasn't, decides to provide economic aid, either weapons, tanks, monetary resources, food, humanitarian aid, and even military advisors as well, that we're going to send to the anti-communist forces in Greece, which eventually will prevail. But what that leads to, in conjunction with a Chinese civil war where we're supporting the anti-communist forces, is this idea of the domino theory, that if one country within a region falls to communism, so will the rest, and we need to stop it at the source itself here. So this becomes known as the domino theory and the American policy of containment. So we're going to provide economic, maybe even military aid to countries that will be anti-communist, will fight against communism. And so this is going to lead eventually to American interventions all over the world. But either way, we're going to take this first step to try to create an anti-communist, pro-democracy government in Greece, not only in Greece, but then also to support neighboring Turkey, because there's this feel that if Turkey gets taken, then so will the rest of the Middle East as well. So the United States acts here in the Greek Civil War immediately. Furthermore, at this time, Europe needs to be rebuilt. And in order to rebuild, you need money to do so. So we reviewed the Marshall Plan, where the United States basically offers to any European country that applies monetary resources to rebuild their country. The European Recovery Plan, which is also better known as the U.S. Marshall Plan. We went through a series of documents that you see on the right-hand side of this slide, whereby it was about convincing not only the American public, but then also the Soviet public and informing them what they believed the Marshall Plan was and what it could become and what it actually resulted in. So you have to decide, in regarding the Marshall Plan, American money, was this aid to just simply rebuild Europe? Or you believe that there's no such thing as a free lunch, and particularly from the Soviet perspective, that this is an American bribe to the rest of Europe. And not only that, but setting up American corporations in Europe to be able to sell their goods and enrich America in doing so. And so this is an intrusion by the United States um, to bring about their ideology of capitalism into all of Europe, and that communism doesn't get a fair shake. But yet, at the exact same time, the Marshall Plan does work. It really does, for countries that receive the aid, a real benefit in recovery after the devastation of the Second World War. So make that decision. Was the Marshall Plan aid or is it bribery? But all the while, the Soviet Union also was trying to act to try to generate communist countries where they could. And so in Czechoslovakia, which was attempting to try to, on one hand, create a Western-style democracy, but then also allowing the communists to play a role in electoral politics and implementing maybe more a socialist vision of the Czechoslovakia. What that results in is an attempt to try to do both. This democratic government holds off for a while, but the communists will be elected to power as the largest party in Czechoslovakia. However, because of the pressure of the Soviet army next door, and not only that, but in their encouragement of the Communist Party to try to act in Czechoslovakia, it results in an overthrow of this government and the initiation of the Communist Party as the sole power in Czechoslovakia. So the question is that we have to answer is, was this a coup, an illegal takeover by the Soviet Union for the Communist Party to take over from the democratically elected Czech government? Or was this revolution going to happen anyways, that the Communist Party was the most powerful anyways, and that Czechoslovakia would become a communist state eventually? Okay, so you make that decision. Was this a Czech revolution or a Czechoslovakian coup? Okay. But with this political context, with the Marshall Plan being enacted, with the Western powers trying to implement the Marshall Plan, but in order to do so, you need financial resources, particularly banks and a currency. And the stalemate that occurs in Germany was that there was little consensus as to what the new German government was going to look like and also what sort of currency. And again, you can't rebuild a country without the need of a currency to make exchanges. And so the United States, Britain, and eventually a Western German government came together in London to create a new government and a new currency in the western half of Germany. And so the response by the Soviet Union was to, in the end, blockade the city of Berlin, which again was surrounded by the Soviet zone, to basically utilize the hunger and in Berlin as a means to get the US and others to come back to the bargaining table and talk about what should happen to Germany afterwards. And so the Soviet Union will blockade Berlin, and the U.S. response was an airlift that, as it turns out, was successful. So you have to make a decision here. Was it illogical and dangerous for Stalin to blockade Berlin, where the response by the United States might actually be able to have to send an armored column through West Germany and maybe start World War III from there? Or were the Western allies just simply too impetuous? They were too quick to try to create a new currency and a new government in Western Germany. So you decide whether the blockade was to follow the Soviet Union or the airlift that was to come was too much for the United States, and it created enormous pressures on the Soviet Union. So you make that decision. All the while divided, just like in Germany, there were the occupied zones in Korea. Now, Korea itself was a Japanese colony that would eventually be determined to have independence after the war. But the question is, would it be in a communist vision or a democratic vision? So Korea itself was occupied by both forces, and eventually North Korea, which was occupied by the Soviet Union, led by Kim Jong-il, or Kim Il-sung, excuse me, will invade the South with the guidance of Stalin and with the approval of Stalin itself here, almost eliminating the semi-democratic South Korean government. Eventually, the United States and the United Nations will intervene and push the North Korean forces uh, close enough to the borders of communist China, where communist China felt threatened to invade. And so from there, you have a stalemated war that will last for the next few years, mostly between China and North Korea, and the United States and South Korea. So the question here is, okay, did the Soviet Union make it worse by basically telling Kim Il Sung, go ahead, invade South Korea? Or was the United States to blame, for going too close to communist China and leading this large communist country to enter into the conflict as well? Was the Soviet Union or the United States more at fault for making things worse on the other side of the world? And then finally, we have a series of defense treaties. Now, both sides now feel like they're a threat to the other. And so, first of all, the United States is going to formulate NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organizations, which you see is in green there, that will oppose any potential invasion from the Soviet Union, whereby if the Soviet Union invades any of these countries in green, they're all going to come together in mutual defense. Feeling threatened by this, the Soviet Union forms a separate Warsaw Pact, the countries that you see in orange there. And eventually now you've got two sides that basically are armed camps looking and staring each other down, with a city right in the middle of Eastern Germany that is also still occupied by the West. So from there, go through all the check boxes and make a decision for each one. And then from there, you can draw a conclusion as to whether or not the Soviet Union or the United States was more at fault for starting the Cold War. So again, make these check boxes that you see here. You make these determinations. I'm going to clear this here, but you make a decision in terms of who is more to blame. All right, we're going to stop this lecture off here and move on to the secondary source chronology in just a moment.